So, listen to this. Martin Ødegaard became football's future before he was even old enough to understand what that really meant. At just 15 years old, he wasn't just a talented kid anymore. He was a headline, a symbol, a promise that millions of people had already decided he would fulfill. And from the outside, everything looked perfect. The biggest clubs in the world were chasing him. Real Madrid signed him, and it felt like his story was already written before it had even begun. But here's the part no one really talks about. What actually happens when your career starts before your life does, when you are no longer growing into football, but football is already shaping who you're supposed to be. At first, this looks like a story we've seen many times before. A wonder kid rises too quickly, struggles under pressure, disappears for a while, and then somehow finds his way back. And it would be easy to place Martin Ødegaard into that same narrative, to say this is simply about early hype and eventual redemption. But the truth is, this story isn't really about failure, and it's not even about a comeback. It's about something much more uncomfortable. Because what if Ødegaard didn't struggle because he wasn't good enough, but because everything around him moved too fast? What if the real issue was never his talent, but the fact that football decided who he was supposed to be long before he had the chance to figure that out himself? And maybe that's why this story feels different, because instead of watching someone rise and fall, we're actually watching someone try to catch up to a life that started without him being ready. Long before the headlines, before Real Madrid, before the pressure, Martin Ødegaard was just a kid in Norway with something that felt different. Not louder, not flashier, but calmer. Almost like the game slowed down when the ball reached his feet and people noticed it early. Not because he was scoring unbelievable goals every week, but because he seemed to understand spaces, timing, and decisions in a way that didn't match his age. And by the time he was playing senior football in Norway, it already felt like he was ahead of where he was supposed to be. But then something shifted, because talent alone doesn't stay quiet for long. And once the media found him, once the words "Wonder Kid" started appearing, everything around him began to change. Suddenly, he wasn't just a promising player anymore. He was being compared, measured, projected into a future that hadn't happened yet. And when the biggest clubs in Europe came calling, it didn't feel like a decision about development. It felt like a moment that was already expected. And that's how, at just 16 years old, he arrived at Real Madrid, not as a player finding his path, but as a symbol of what football believed he would become. And maybe that's where the problem quietly began, because this should have been the start of everything. But instead, it became the start of expectations that were far bigger than the player himself. At Real Madrid, everything changed, but not in the way people expected, because instead of stepping into the spotlight, Ødegaard slowly disappeared into the background, training with the first team at times, playing for Castilla at others, constantly moving but never truly settling. And on paper, it looked like development, like patience, like a young player being carefully introduced to the highest level. But in reality, it felt different, because every move he made was being watched. Every performance judged not as a step forward, but as a comparison to what people thought he should already be. And that kind of pressure doesn't shout, it lingers, it sits quietly in every touch, every decision, every moment, where hesitation starts to replace instinct. And as the months turned into years, the narrative began to shift, not dramatically, but subtly, from the next big thing to what happened to him. And that's a dangerous place to be, because it doesn't feel like failure. It feels like fading, like existing between expectations and reality without fully belonging to either. And the loans didn't fix it, moving from club to club, different systems, different roles, never enough time to build something real, just enough to keep going without ever fully arriving. And this is where most wonder kids begin to disappear, not in one big moment, but slowly, quietly, as the gap between who they are and who they were supposed to be keeps growing. And this is where the story becomes harder to ignore, because if you look closely, Ødegaard's journey wasn't defined by one big failure, but by a series of moments that never quite connected. His loan to Heerenveen showed flashes of talent, but not consistency. At Vitesse, he improved, more control, more responsibility, but still nothing that matched the expectations placed on him years before. And by the time he arrived at Real Sociedad, something finally started to shift. Not dramatically, but noticeably, because for the first time he wasn't being treated like a future superstar or a failed wonder kid. He was simply being used as a footballer, given a role, a structure, a purpose, and in that environment his game began to make sense again. The movement, the vision, the calmness under pressure, it all started to come together in a way that hadn't been possible before. And you could see it in the numbers: more chances created, more involvement, more influence over the rhythm of the game, but more importantly, you could see it in how he played. Less hesitation, fewer rushed decisions, more control, more identity. And then came Arsenal. And this is where everything truly changed. Not because it was a bigger stage, but because it was the first place that seemed to understand him completely. Mikel Arteta didn't try to force him into a role he wasn't ready for. He built the system around what Ødegaard already was. A player who needed time on the ball, who needed trust, who needed clarity. And slowly, game by game, he became the centre of that system. Not through hype, not through expectations, but through consistency, leadership and intelligence. And the stats began to reflect it. Goals, assists, chances created. But again, the numbers only told part of the story because what really mattered was that for the first time since he was a teenager, Ødegaard wasn't playing to prove anything. He wasn't chasing the version of himself that people had imagined years ago. He was simply playing his game, and that's why it felt different. Because this wasn't a sudden rise, it was a gradual return to something that had always been there, hidden beneath years of pressure, movement, and misunderstanding. And maybe that's the most important detail in all of this, because Ødegaard didn't suddenly become a better player. He just finally found a place where he was allowed to be one. But here's where the story takes a turn, because if you've been watching this as a comeback, then you've been looking at it the wrong way, because Ødegaard didn't suddenly rise again. He didn't rebuild himself from failure, and he didn't prove everyone wrong in the way people usually expect. The truth is much quieter than that, and maybe even more uncomfortable, because what if nothing about him actually changed? What if the talent, the intelligence, the composure had always been there from the very beginning, and the real issue was never about losing it, but about never being given the right moment to use it? Because think about it, at Real Madrid, he was too early, too young, too surrounded by expectations that didn't match his reality. On loan, he was constantly adjusting, never staying long enough to grow roots, always adapting instead of evolving, and only when he arrived at a place that gave him time, structure, and trust did everything finally align. And that changes the entire perspective of his story, because this isn't a comeback. This isn't redemption. This is something much simpler and much more revealing. This is the first time his career actually started the way it was supposed to. And that realization shifts everything, because instead of asking how he returned, the real question becomes, why did it take so long for football to let him begin? And when you step back for a moment, Ødegaard's story stops being just about one player and starts revealing something much bigger about modern football. Because the game today doesn't just develop talent, it accelerates it. It takes young players and pushes them forward faster than ever before. Not because they're ready, but because the system demands it. Clubs are searching for the next superstar earlier. Media narratives are built faster. Expectations grow louder. And suddenly a player isn't just growing, he's being watched, analysed and judged in real time. And in that environment, timing becomes everything. Because if you arrive too late, you miss your chance. But if you arrive too early, you might lose yourself before you even understand who you are as a player. And that's what makes Ødegaard's case so interesting, because he didn't fail in the traditional sense. He didn't collapse under pressure in one dramatic moment. Instead, he experienced something much more subtle. He lived through a version of football where development and expectation were completely out of sync, where his name grew faster than his career. And by the time he finally reached the level people expected, the journey behind him had already been far more complicated than anyone realised. And that raises a bigger question about the game itself, because how many players have gone through the same process without ever finding their way back? And now, when you watch Martin Ødegaard at Arsenal, it finally looks right. Not perfect, not flawless, but natural, like everything is happening at the pace it was always supposed to. He's no longer the kid trying to live up to a label. He's the player controlling the game, dictating tempo, leading a team, wearing the captain's armband, not because of hype, but because of trust. And that's what makes this moment feel different, because this isn't a sudden explosion of talent. It's the quiet result of years that didn't make sense, finally coming together. Every misplaced loan, every moment on the bench, every question about whether he would ever become what people expected. All of it leads here, and yet there's something slightly uncomfortable about it, because as complete as he looks now, as composed and